This hearing of the Military Construction, Veterans Affairs, and Related Agencies Subcommittee will come to order. Thank you all for participating in this hearing on remediation and impact of PFAS. Before we begin, as this hearing is fully virtual, we must again address a few housekeeping items. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there is a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice a clock on your screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn to yellow. When your time has expired, the clock will turn red, and I will begin to recognize the next member. In terms of the speaking order, we will follow the order set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member. Then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority, and finally, members not present at the time the hearing is called to order. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. I might have an emergency, so I need to pause the meeting for a moment. I will the committee stands in recess for a few moments. Okay, I apologize. Thank you. We're having this hearing today to dig deeper into an issue that many on this committee care a lot about, as members of Congress responsible for the well-being of our military and our veterans and as human beings. This will be a critical look at a public health and environmental crisis that has challenged the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs for years. I'm referring to the widespread chemical contamination of our military installations and surrounding communities by a family of man-made toxic chemicals known as PFAS. This contamination has plagued our service members, veterans, and even their families and communities for decades now. This is a story of tragedy, deception, bureaucratic incompetence, and tireless advocacy by service members, veterans, and nonprofit advocates who have devoted themselves to elevating this issue, seeking out justice, and fighting to clean up military sites so that no one else is poisoned by this toxic mess. This is not our first hearing on this important subject. I'm proud to say that this subcommittee has aggressively pursued answers from the Department of Defense on their plans to clean up these contaminants and provide resources to those who have been harmed. We expect a full progress report on those efforts today. This year, along with the Department of Defense, we will be hearing from the Department of Veterans Affairs so that we can get VA's perspective on the long-lasting impacts of PFAS exposure on veterans and their families, and hopefully provide clarity on how veterans can navigate the VA when they are struggling with health effects related to PFAS exposure. For decades, PFAS chemicals were used in a variety of industrial and consumer applications. Notably, PFAS chemicals were and continue to be used in large quantities on military bases in the form of firefighting foams, otherwise known as aqueous film-forming foam, or AFFF. Our military performs training exercises with AFFF to practice suppressing potent fires caused by aircraft fuel. This usage caused decades of cascading harms that few, except producers like 3M, could have seen coming. The toxic chemicals in the foam seeped into the ground and insidiously spread throughout nearby communities, tainted nearby farmland, and even penetrated groundwater supplies. Most perniciously, Dangerous quantities of these chemicals have been absorbed into the bloodstreams of the brave souls who signed up to serve this country in our armed forces. They signed up to defend this country from its enemies. They never signed up to absorb toxic contamination, and they certainly never signed up to volunteer their families for exposure to these toxic chemicals. And this story has an even darker, more infuriating side. Long has there been evidence to support a causal link between exposure to PFAS chemicals and serious health problems, including cancer, as well as thyroid, reproductive, and developmental issues. And yet, for decades, across administrations of both parties, little to no action has been taken by the US government. Much of that inaction can be traced to the decades-long campaign of subterfuge and deception propagated by producers like the 3M Company and DuPont. As far back as 1950, studies conducted by 3M showed that these chemicals could build up in our blood. By the 1960s, animal studies conducted by 3M and DuPont revealed that PFAS chemicals could pose health risks. But the companies kept the studies secret from their employees and the public for decades, and even refused to hand over internal documentation of these adverse health effects until forced to do so by the courts. In 1966, the Federal Food and Drug Administration rejected a DuPont petition to use PFAS chemicals as a food additive, citing liver studies indicating some government agencies knew of its health risks. The US Navy began to raise serious concerns about the potential toxicity of firefighting foams and its harmful effects decades ago, noting in 1978 that, quote, the 3M Company has not provided any useful information about the components of FC206, which is one of 3M's firefighting foams. Beginning in the early 2000s, major corporations, many of which supplied the chemical to DoD, began to halt the use and production of PFAS due to growing concerns by the scientific and healthcare communities. In January of 2009, the EPA released a provisional health advisory warning of exposure to PFAS chemicals. And in 2016, the EPA went further in issuing a lifetime health advisory, warning that concentrated PFOS and PFOA in drinking water was suspected of causing serious health concerns. Unfortunately, this advisory was merely that. EPA chose not to incorporate a real enforcement mechanism. The Department of Defense waited until 2016, after decades of concern over exposure to PFAS, before it finally began to clean up these harmful chemicals. However, the department is still not doing enough, citing a lack of evidence. DoD has been slow to spend and execute hundreds of millions of congressionally appropriated cleanup funds. Let me be clear. There is solid scientific evidence that PFAS exposure is harmful to human health and the environment. The EPA states on its website, quote, there is evidence that exposure to PFAS can lead to adverse health outcomes in humans. PFAS stays in the human body for long periods of time. As a result, as people get exposed to PFAS from different sources over time, the level of PFAS in their bodies may increase to the point where they suffer from adverse health effects, unquote. HHS's Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry released a draft toxicological profile of PFAS in 2018, after it was discovered that the Trump administration was delaying its release. The report included hundreds of pages of evidence that explained that the US government had not taken this problem seriously enough, and that EPA's health advisory level was likely set far too high. As more and more evidence comes to light of the serious long-term side effects of PFAS, we need quick and efficient remediation and a thorough, comprehensive healthcare approach for our veterans and the communities who were exposed. It is past time that federal agencies start being honest with impacted communities, service members, veterans, and their families about the scope of the problem and explain the work needed to be done to address not only the cleanup of this toxin, but also the health and environmental reparations required. It's also long past time for these agencies to issue enforceable rules to stop the spread of this contamination. Even more, DoD needs to expedite the replacement of toxic AFFF on military installations where they are still in use today. This subcommittee is committed to doing our part in a larger whole-of-government approach to invest in these critical cleanup and healthcare efforts. I'm proud that the appropriations bill we passed last year provided an additional $100 million for PFAS identification, mitigation, and cleanup at closed military locations under our BRAC account. As a proud member of the bipartisan Congressional PFAS Task Force, I was also pleased to vote for the PFAS Action Act, a comprehensive approach to regulating PFAS chemicals, cleaning up contamination, and protecting public health. Today's witnesses will help tell the story of PFAS at our military bases and the impact it has had on the environment, surrounding communities, and those who served. Our first panel will feature Mr. Paul Kramer, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Sustainment Installations at the Department of Defense. He is accompanied by Mr. Mark Carell, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Environment, Safety, and Infrastructure, and Dr. Terry Rausch, the Director of Medical Research and Development, also at the Department of Defense. Also, as part of our first panel, we will have Dr. Patricia Hastings, Chief Consultant of Post-Deployment Health Services, Veterans Health Administration at the Department of Veterans Affairs. These witnesses today will be able to give us a progress report on the ongoing efforts to clean up contamination, the ongoing research being conducted, and hopefully explain why these two departments are not doing more to respond to the crisis in an expeditious way. I am particularly interested in hearing how this new administration will approach PFAS differently and hopefully mark a clean break from the lackadaisical approach of the previous administration. Additionally, the Department of Veterans Affairs perspective is vital because our commitment to protecting service members does not end when they step off a base. We have a responsibility to our veterans to address the injuries and illnesses they suffered as a result of their military service, whether it's a blast injury from combat or repeated exposure to toxic firefighting foam. VA is uniquely positioned to track, study, and treat conditions that may have been caused by PFAS exposure, yet PFAS has not received the focus at VA that it deserves. The comprehensive research and clinical services that VA can provide through its environmental exposure programs could make it far easier for veterans and doctors to understand exposure-related health conditions, as well as prove a service connection, opening the door for veterans to receive many other benefits, VA benefits. I'm eager to discuss how we can better use the power of the VA to make a difference for many service members affected by PFAS exposure. Our second panel will feature two leaders in addressing PFAS contamination. Dr. Jamie DeWitt, an expert on PFAS contamination and an associate professor of the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology at East Carolina University, and Ms. Erin Brockovich, an environmental activist, consumer advocate, and longtime champion of PFAS cleanup and public education on harmful contaminants. They will discuss the impacts of PFAS on individual health, as well as the surrounding communities and the environment at large, highlighting why action on the issue is so important. Thank you all for being here this afternoon, and we look forward to hearing your testimony. Before we start with our first panel, I'd like to recognize the acting ranking member, Congressman Valadao, for his opening remarks.
Good afternoon, and thank you for yielding to me, Madam Chair. As you know, I am filling in for Ranking Member Carter today. This committee plays just a small part in a larger discussion and debate about environmental management, regulation, and remediation at military installations. Our role is focused on funding the cleanup of former military bases as well as providing oversight concerning these efforts and ensuring funds are spent efficiently and effectively. I am especially looking forward to hearing more about the Defense Department's current remediation efforts and upcoming plans and activities. I'm also looking forward to hear about the Department of Veterans Affairs role and the effects that PFAS has on our veterans. Madam Chair, I'd like to commend you for putting together an impressive witness list for today's hearing. The witnesses have years of experience and expertise, which will allow us to really dig into the issues today and help informing our funding decisions for fiscal year 2022. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Valadao. I appreciate your kind words. I'm told that neither Chairwoman DeLauro or Ranking Member Granger are with us. So with that, we'll welcome our first panel. As I mentioned, our witnesses are Mr. Paul Kramer of the Department of Defense, accompanied by Mr. Mark Carell and Dr. Terry Rausch, and Dr. Patricia R. Hastings of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Mr. Kramer, your full written testimony will be included in the record. You are recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz, Ranking Member Valadao.
Mr. Kramer, you may need to turn the volume up. It's a little difficult to hear you.
Audio check, is that? Turn yours on too. Yeah, let's try them all. See if that makes. Can you hear me better, Madam Chairwoman?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to provide an update on DoD's actions related to PFAS. I am Paul Kramer, currently the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy, Installations, and Environment, and performing the duties of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Sustainment. Joining me today are Mr. Mark Carell, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Environment, Safety, and Infrastructure, and Dr. Terry Rausch, the Director of Medical Research in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs. DoD has a long track record of addressing PFAS issues, responsibly following the science and the direction of Congress. This record includes a list of accomplishments and strong interagency collaboration. The department has has in place a well-structured and, thanks to Congress, a well-resourced DoD approach to address PFAS responsibly. This does not mean that there's not room for improvement, specifically in the areas of increased transparency regarding the progress of our work. I want to first thank Congress for their strong support to the Department of Defense by providing the resources we need to protect the health and safety of our service members, their families, and the DoD civilian workforce, and the DoD communities that serve around our installations. We recognize that our accomplishments to date are not sufficient alone to meet the challenges that we face, and accordingly, we are continuing our efforts of the DoD PFAS Task Force. As you know, the DoD PFAS Task Force was established in July 2019 to provide strategic leadership and direction to ensure a coordinated, aggressive, and holistic approach on DoD-wide efforts to address PFAS. The task force continues to diligently address PFAS and is postured to be responsive to the direction of this administration. Our task force efforts are organized along three major lines: mitigate and eliminate the use of the current aqueous film-forming foam, fulfilling our cleanup responsibilities, and understanding the impacts of PFAS on human health. The Department is committed to addressing its PFAS releases to the environment under the federal cleanup law. As of September 30th, 2020, DoD has identified 108 base, realigned, and or closed installations where DoD may have used or potentially released PFAS, and is conducting a PFAS assessment at these installations. DoD's priority is to quickly address PFAS and or PFOA found in drinking water above the EPA lifetime health advisory levels. Under the CERCLA process, no one is currently drinking water, whether on or off base, with PFAS or PFOA above the health advisory levels, where DoD is the known source. DoD is also investing in research to develop technologies to quantify and clean up PFAS. These efforts reinforce DoD's commitment to protect human health. Addressing the challenges of PFAS is a national issue that will require national solutions and interagency efforts. While the department acting alone cannot be the single solution to this challenge, we acknowledge that the role that Congress has given us and remain committed to doing our part. Congressional support on our efforts has been invaluable, and we look forward to working closely with this subcommittee and other stakeholders in the public, private, and not-for-profit sector to achieve a lasting solution. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kramer. Dr. Hastings, your full written testimony will be entered into the record, and you're recognized to summarize your remarks for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, Wasserman Schultz, Congressman Valadeo, and members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss the ongoing activities at VA and what we are undertaking to address the health concerns that may be associated with the per or polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. VA exists to help veterans improve their quality of their life, and when military service has negatively impacted their health, we are here to provide care and, in some cases, compensation for those conditions that are associated with their service. Service-related exposures are a major concern of veterans, and actually is the reason that my office was created, and that is post-deployment health services. As you've already noted, PFAS are persistent in the environment, and since they are used in the manufacturing of so many products, they're widespread in the environment and internationally. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention National Health and Nutrition Examination survey data, these chemicals are detected in 99% of the general population of the United States. PFAS concentrations have decreased over time, and in large part due to decreasing use of these chemicals. One of the issues we have is in addressing the PFAS concerns of the veteran population. There are several challenges. Since these chemicals are not unique to military environments, making comparisons for non-veteran populations becomes more difficult. Ideally, we would like to see levels for military members at accession and when they leave service, and possibly at some time during their service, to adequately assess the burden of military PFAS exposures. VA does work very closely with its partners, specifically the Agency for Toxic Substance Disease Registry, ATSDR, We work with the EPA, the National Academy of Sciences, and of course with our partners at DoD, as well as many others. We meet with ATSDR routinely, and we review their multi-site health study and the work being done by our other partners in academia. The science into PFAS exposures is advancing and will be used to make informed decisions about the risks. In conclusion, the health consequences of PFAS exposure represent a concern for the VA and all of the veterans that we serve. We are closely monitoring the evolving science, working with our federal partners so that we can support our veterans now and into the future. To this end, your continued support is critical. This concludes my testimony, and I am prepared to respond to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hastings. We'll proceed in the standard 5-minute rounds, alternating sides, recognizing members in order of seniority as they arrived at the beginning of the hearing. Please be mindful of your time and allow the witnesses time to answer your questions within your 5-minute turn, and we will continue to be flexible in that towards the end of your questions. Okay. Mr. Kramer, the department has received, as you mentioned, significant appropriated funds to address PFAS for the last 3 years. I'd like to understand better how you used those funds and whether or not you're able to spend all the money that we're appropriating for PFAS remediation.
Madam Chairman, our main effort to date has been and on the research and development of alternatives to AFFF. We've invested substantially into that research and showing some positive results going forward into further testing to meet the deadlines for replacement AFFF. The other portions of the funds have been heavily invested in removal actions associated with installations where we have found water sources that exceeded the 70 parts per trillion lifetime health advisory, and so we're going through remediation actions for those, and we have 77 locations that's combined off-post and on-post where we have found drinking water that exceeded the standards, and then we employ remedial actions to bring that water source back down below the lifetime health advisory.
Are you able to spend all the money that we're appropriating for PFAS remediation?
Yes, yes, we are.
Okay. Can you handle further increases if we wish to appropriate more funding? And would more significant appropriations for PFAS frac remediation expedite those efforts?
It would, and we could get back to you on what that amount would be. We don't want to exceed our capacity because there is a limit as we go through our circular process. It's a logical step. We want to have the right amount of funds to do that activity going forward. So we can definitely give you a rundown by fiscal year what that would look like.
That would be helpful. Thank you. I'd like to ask Dr. Rausch and Dr. Hastings a question about the research that both DoD and VA are doing on the impact of PFAS exposure on service members and veterans. On your surrounding communities and the environment. Can we start with Dr. Rausch? What research is DoD conducting and on all of those categories of individuals?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. We are closely monitoring the research that is being done out of CDC and
I'm asking specifically what research. I'm sorry, reclaiming my time. I'm sorry, reclaiming my time. I'm asking what research specifically is DoD conducting on the impact of PFAS exposure?
On the health effects, we have 2 studies that are going on right now, which are focusing on cancer. And those are epidemiologic studies. One is using the serum repository, and the other is using another database that related to African American women.
Are you focused on surrounding communities, on service members, on veterans? the environment? What are the focuses of those studies?
Yeah, so one study that is being conducted by NCI is focused on looking at Air Force members using the DoD serum repository. And that is a focus on testicular cancer. And then the other, like I said, is on African-American women that are not service members, but a part of the larger community in the area where they are, where that database is. That's around South Carolina.
Okay, and is that using DoD funds?
That is DoD appropriated funds. That's the Defense Health Program.
Okay, 2 studies does not sound like very much. I mean, you're the largest budget in the executive branch. Why isn't the department doing more?
Our budget for medical research and development is pretty broad in scope, but our focus is really on combat casualty care, battlefield trauma, things that are within the jurisprudence of the DoD mission. And we would
I would think it would be the DoD mission not to sicken your active duty military.
NIH and CDC.
Right. I would think that it would be part of your mission not to sicken your active duty military and to make sure that they don't have long-term health problems. So 2 studies does not seem like a real commitment to getting to the bottom of this. Why aren't you doing more?
Well, we can certainly do more, but like I said before, our focus is on trauma care, mental health of our military members. And when there's another department's or agency's mission, like EPA and CDC, we rely on them to do that research, and we work with them very closely.
I understand, and I understand that's been your position, but why should it be up to other agencies when DoD is the one using the toxins and has the largest budget in the executive branch?
Well, once again, Madam Chair, DoD is limited in terms of medical research on our priority programs, and when another agency, such as CDC or NCI, has that mission, we rely on them and work closely with them.
But presumably, if we gave you the resources, to focus your research, even if you were using other agencies to do so, because that's their area of expertise, you could do more than 2 studies, correct?
We could certainly do more if there was congressional direction directing us to do more. But we're going to focus on our battlefield problems.
Well, and part of the reason we're having this hearing is to suggest that you should focus on more than just your battlefield and make sure that the people who are on your battlefield aren't being sickened by toxins that you're making them use to fight fires. And Dr. Hastings, if you would answer this, the same question, is the VA doing any research of its own on the effects of PFAS exposure?
We are not doing original research, and similar to DoD, we are looking to ATSDR. We are working with our federal partners. Our toxicologist is involved with the whole of government approach, and we do look at the research that's coming out, most of it having started rather late in the recent past, the last decade. ATSDR, as you know, is doing a multi-site study looking at the communities surrounding the military bases, and we meet with them monthly to review many studies, PFAS being one of them, and our toxicologist meets routinely with EPA. We are not doing original research, but we are looking at the research that's out there. We do also do mortality studies on our veterans. We have not seen a signal that points toward PFAS at this time, but we are looking at that specifically with our overview of morbidity and mortality in healthcare and VA.
Okay, I would again, for you as well, strongly suggest that VA could and should be doing more.
I would absolutely be amenable to that. My office exists to find answers for veterans, and we have some of the best epidemiologists, bar none, anywhere in the U.S. So we'd be happy to do that.
I'd love to follow up with you and maybe sit down and talk with you about what else could be done.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you to the members for your indulgence. Mr. Valadeo, you're recognized for at least 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this question might be directed towards Mr. Kramer, but can you describe the process the department uses to select BRAC sites for PFAS cleanup?
We look to all BRAC sites. We don't select the BRAC sites, and so we did a review of all the closed bases. And I misspoke earlier. There's 114. So we're looking at 114 bases that were closed under a previous BRAC round, and then from the initial assessments, we'll go down to the next step within the circular process.
So, and I assume of those bases, there are some that are priorities. Which sites of those are your greatest concern, and what needs to be done there?
So we have, I don't know that we've got to the greatest concern. So we're treating them all as a risk base, and so we have 45 that are the PASI is underway, and out of those we'll go to the next step that we'll take a deeper look at, and from there, based on the highest risk to human health, we'll prioritize that work as it comes out. As we sit here today, I don't know that we have a prioritized list of closed BRAC sites.
So if I misunderstand, make sure I'm not misunderstanding you. You haven't even gotten to the point where you know where the greatest risks are at today?
Well, we know there are some that have went further along than others. That we're taking, actions on, but yeah, as a whole, we're still not complete. We're still doing the initial assessments.
How long does it take? I mean, would you even know this then? It almost sounds like I'm getting a little too far ahead of you, but how long does it typically take to clean up a known contamination site?
Depends on the contaminant and the level of contamination. It could take upwards of 30 years. And based on the chemical, some of these are what we refer to euphemistically as pump and treat, which is a long-term process. So we want to go through the circular, each of the steps to identify the source, the level, so that we are targeting the cleanup to try to, shorten that period down. One of the real issues with PFAS, as we know, it's called a forever chemical because that bond is so strong, and so there's research going on now to try to figure out how to expedite the cleanup process for PFAS.
What other contaminants, environmental contaminants, is the DoD concerned with as of right now?
I'm sorry, sir, can you say that again?
I assume there are environmental contaminants that DoD is concerned with at the same time. Can you name some of those?
I'm sorry, sir. Yeah, you're
other contaminants that we are concerned about.
Oh, yeah. So we have within the circular process, there are BRAC sites that we're already into the cleanup process that we're going after, and we're looking at PFAS on top of that previous look at a BRAC site. All BRAC sites, when closed, went through a circular process review and came up with a remedial strategy that was approved by the regulators. And I just want to add to on the last one. So the greatest concern would be exposure to drinking water at our closed sites, and so where we have found groundwater sources or water tables that do have PFAS, that is the known source of drinking water, we are cleaning up that drinking water to below the lifetime health advisor or to meet the state standards for the folks that are served by that source.
Okay, so you mentioned this a little bit, but just to follow up, currently it seems pump and treat is the only method the DoD is using to treat PFAS contaminated water. In last year's omnibus appropriations bill, the committee noted that this method of PFAS remediation is both costly and time consuming, and encouraged the department to continue to explore innovative technological solutions for treating PFAS contaminations in groundwater. What steps has the department taken to seek out alternative PFAS treatment options that are effective, less expensive, and hopefully quicker?
So that's a great question. We have over 100 studies that are ongoing, and some of those look at the alternate treatment methods that have went through from a concept stage to a bench test stage to more of a larger scale laboratory test. And so as we work through that process, we're going to attempt to find an alternative to pump and treat. So we are funding academia, private industry to do some of the research in that area to find an alternate to pump and treat. I'll be glad to sit down. We have I said there's over 100 different studies that you guys help us fund through our sort of ESTCP research programs that are paying some dividends, but it's still in the bench test stage, if you will.
Okay, and if the chair will indulge me just to follow up just a little bit over. Thank you.
Yes, of course.
Appreciate that. Thank you. So the waste produced from pump and treat in the form of PFAS saturated filters is hard to dispose of in a way that does not potentially lead to further environmental contamination. Can you elaborate more on your disposal methods and how DoD is ensuring that once PFAS contaminants are removed, they are not released back into the environment?
So it's a great question. We follow the disposal guidance that exists through EPA or state standards, and so when we collect a media that has PFAS contained in it, such as a GAC filter, that we will process that in accordance with the permit that is given to whether it's the Department of Defense runs that wastewater treatment plant, or our private partners or the city. And so those medias then are disposed of in a regulated, permitted landfill in accordance with those standards. And EPA does have a guidance out. They had it out for comment. We provide comments, and we're waiting for the disposal guidance to further get codified.
All right, thank you. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Thank you, Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Case, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Kramer, I have a specific situation here in Hawaii, which is a great concern for Hawaii, but may well be a broader concern across the country. Here in Hawaii, our Hawaii State Department of Health has had multiple episodes in which we have not been able to access permissions to do testing at military facilities and properties. This is major here because we have a tremendous military footprint, all services that has been here for a long, long time, so century plus. Schofield Barracks, for example, with the Army is at over a century old and is a major area from that perspective. Our Hawaii Department of Health has a current grant from the Environmental Protection Agency to do a study of PFAS in wastewater biosolids from wastewater treatment plants and landfill leachate across our state. It's a statewide project. Our plans are to sample 6 landfills and 8 wastewater treatment plants, as well as soils where wastewater treatment plant biosolids are composted or used as a soil amendment. This is critical for us because our water supply is artesian, comes from aquifers, and the aquifers don't much care about where the leaching water comes from. And as a matter of fact, it comes from military installations as well as non-military installations. So our Department of Health is in the process of making plans for sampling and analysis, but has run into roadblocks from the Army and the Navy about allowing sampling at their facilities. My understanding is that the Army has straight out said no sampling of the water at the Schofield Barracks wastewater treatment plant. And as to the Navy, there's been a long negotiation with NAVFAC Hawaii about whether we can similarly do the same thing with the Navy's wastewater treatment plant. Obviously, that's of great concern to me. And so I'm asking, number one, do you have any specific information on why the military commanders on site in Hawaii would not allow our State Department of Health to look statewide and on a broad basis or for PFAS concerns? And then secondarily, on the broader level, what exactly is the Department of Defense's policy and instructions to base commanders to allow state and county governments to sample on base or base facilities or for PFAS that might be not only a problem for the bases themselves, but for the broader community?
Congressman, those are great questions and require a very detailed answer between services. And I'll be glad to work with you and your staff to come up with an answer that is specific to the question about each of the military departments. On a broad scale, wastewater treatment plants are permitted facilities by the state, and so there's some responsivity on behalf of the military departments to the regulators in that, and I'll be glad to have the military departments, myself, and your staff sit down and we can go through in detail exactly what the concerns are at the local level. Over.
Are you aware of any specific instructions from the Department of Defense to base commanders throughout the country, either specifying that they should cooperate fully with state and county governments in terms of PFAS-related identification concerns, or the contrary, that they should be very careful to do that or have to check back with home base before they do that? Are you aware of that on a national level? Do you have a policy?
We have issued no policy to either side where it says you shouldn't speak with locals, or you should. It's a matter of routine that we are transparent with the local communities, and if need be, we'll issue some guidance back out to ensure that they are transparent with the regulators. But we have issued no DoD guidance that would suggest that we as the Department of Defense are not going to talk to state regulators about facilities. Over.
And I would thank you very much for that. First of all, I think that's the exactly right thing to do under the circumstances. But I would also add that I would not want that policy or instruction or guidance to be limited to state-regulated wastewater treatment plants. There could well be activities on bases of great concern beyond the bases themselves to state and local health officials that are not regulated in any way, shape, or form by the state and county government. So I wouldn't want that to be, relying upon a condition that it's a state-regulated operation that you have to be transparent on. I think that's across the board. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir, I would. Yeah, we've got to take a holistic look at those potential sites for release and then make sure we take appropriate action with that.
Okay, I appreciate that very much and would love to follow up with you as to the Hawaii specific situation. But like I said, this may well need clarification across the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Casey yields back. Now I'd like to recognize Mr. Rutherford for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the panel members. I really appreciate all of you being here. I have 3 major military installations in my district. Well, two basically now. One is already gone through BRAC and gone back to the city. And so I guess Mr. Kramer, let me start with this. The Naval Air Station Jacksonville had PFAS testing on November 9th. They sent a letter out December 7th of 20 saying that they had tested and there was no PFAS contaminants located. But I know there's also a policy that DoD had implemented. They were going to do testing every 3 years, I believe. Can you tell me how the rollout of that is going through all of the DoD installations after what we've had, I guess, 1 year?
So we did initial testing on all installations, and then there was a follow-on policy that went out and said that we would periodically test, and it's by the military departments. We, as the Department of Defense, are not mandating a list of 1 to N list of installations by year. But instructions issued to the military departments was that it's not a one-time test all the water, which is where we identified the first 20 plus sites, and then it increased a few of those that had drinking water sources that exceeded PFAS, and we were then providing the treatment. We realized that as was mentioned earlier, groundwater moves, and then so in the aquifers, they're not indiscriminate. And so we did issue follow-on guidance that said, periodically go back in and retest. And it's the greatest concern places you're going to have to do more frequently than not, where there's a higher concentration of PFAS that had been used.
Okay, and at the BRAC facilities that I think Cecil Field, NAS, Naval Air Station Cecil Field in Jacksonville went back in the first round of BRAC, I believe, back in 90, 91, something like that. Are they doing PFAS testing at those sites as well? And because I didn't get a similar letter from anybody about Cecil Field like I did NAS Jax.
He's just talking about a public notice?
He's talking about fully transferred land, probably. I don't know what
Right, it's fully transferred land. It's gone back to BRAC. It's back to.
So we are testing, and I was just what I was asking the staff here is the letter you're referring to. It was a public notice letter that was issued.
Yes, this was basically a letter from the commanding officer at NAS Jax it's to all their building occupants, and I got a copy of it. It says, our testing is done, no PFAS located, but that's at NAS Jax main side. I'm wondering about the BRAC facility that property's been transferred back. Are you looking at that, or does the city need to go out and do that testing?
No, as I mentioned earlier, we're doing the testing of those groundwater sources. We're out testing the wells, because they're a closed installation, there's no real assigned garrison installation commander for that letter. So I was asking it, so we can make sure that the results that we have are made available to you, Congressman.
Thank you. I'd love to know about that. And finally, let me ask this really quickly. I know my time is running out. I want to go back to something the chairwoman was asking you about earlier about the funding that's been appropriated, your ability to expend those funds, and whether you can expend more. I want to follow up on that and ask also, is there a list, or can you give us an idea of what you've been able to accomplish with those funds that you've already had? What facilities have been cleaned up? Exactly how was the money spent, and what are the successes that we're seeing?
Congressman, that's a great question, and we will. It's too lengthy for me to talk about today our successes, and we will provide to this subcommittee and in fact the whole committee a list of the expenditures of prior year appropriations, where we're going, what we believe is accomplished, what phase we're in the circle process, and going forward. And we're glad to do that.
Okay, thank you very much. Madam Chair, I see my time has run out. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and yes, if you could provide that for the record, and that way we can make sure that information is distributed to all the members.
Yes, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. Okay, Ms. Pingree, you're recommend. Ms. Pingree, you're recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm happy to take your recommendations as well. So, thank you so much for holding this hearing. It's just such a difficult and important topic, and I appreciate all of you, the witnesses, being here with us today. So, on the DoD side, I know people have been kind of edging around this question, but I don't have a good understanding on it. When will the DoD complete the testing for every military base or BRAC base that is suspected of a PFAS problem?
We are on track to complete all of the initial assessments by the end of 2023. We had some slight delay with the pandemic access, getting folks out there. So originally we thought we would get done 22, but we'll be 2023. we'll complete all of the initial assessments and then move on. But as I mentioned earlier, we have tested drinking water sources, which are our utmost concern. And so while we're continuing to do the assessment of all locations, we have taken actions to remove PFAS in all places where we found that the PFAS exceeded the lifetime health advisory.
So just so I understand that, I mean, we do have bases. I'm from Maine, so we have BRAC bases that did have air installations, Loring Air Force Base, Brunswick Naval Air Station. So should I assume from that you have yet to test those, or I mean, how do you know if there's a drinking water problem if you haven't tested there, I guess? And 2023 seems like a long time for a health hazard.
So thanks, man. Mark Rowe from Air Force. So I can't speak to, I can't speak to all of the bases out there. What I can say is that at our BRAC locations today, we have 39 BRAC locations in the Air Force, and I'm happy to get with you later on which ones those are, where we've done preliminary assessments and determined where we need to go and moved into site inspection. Of those, 29 will move to remedial investigation. So what Mr. Kramer was speaking to a minute ago is that by 2023, the site inspections will be complete. So we'll have the first two pieces of CERCLA done. Then we move into remedial investigation, or actually are moving into remedial investigation, which is where we define the scope and constituents of the plume. We'll have all of our remedial investigations awarded for the Air Force, at least, by FY25, but I'm happy to get with you later to discuss specific installation.
Okay, well, we'll follow up about those to see if you, I mean, what you've looked at so far. So given the fact that you don't know yet exactly how many there will be, but sort of based on the percentage of ones that you've investigated that do have problems, do you have any ballpark figure about what the long-term cost is going to be?
So we have an estimate, and I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood. Just to do the cleanup is probably going to end somewhere between $2 billion, $3 billion-ish as we go along. And until we know what the magnitude of the cleanup is going to be, the procedures that we're going to use, and then how many of those locations over the next 5 to 7 year time frame, it's really hard to pin that down until we get further down in the CERCLA process to get that finite granularity over.
Okay, so we know about at least one situation, I guess, in New Mexico where a dairy farm was near a base and was severely contaminated. And I've experienced other situations in our state, not necessarily from a military use, but where PFAS has been on the land. And it's so destructive for the farmer, for the animals, for the groundwater. My understanding is that the FY21 NDA requires the Department of Defense, in conjunction with the USDA, to notify farmers when you find a situation in the drinking water. Have you done any notifications in the area? Is there more than one situation than the one that's pretty widely known about in, I think it's New Mexico, not Arizona?
So we are in that process of, we're working in concert with the Department of Ag to identify the landowners of the farms, 1 mile gradient of the base, and those letters are now going out to those farmers. Over.
So,
since Mr. Correll's got more to add, but
okay, go ahead.
I can speak for the Air Force, and I can tell you that the Air Force has approximately 2,500 of these that we need to send out. We've issued about 400 so far, and we expect to have the last 1,500 to 2,000 out to all of those agricultural operations by the middle of April. Those are being done by our installations commanders so that those operators can then, as part of the community, can talk to their installation commander about what's going on and where the Air Force is going from there. So at least that gives you a sense of where one service is.
Great, and I appreciate that you're moving on that. Although I guess I would ask overall, thank you for explaining what the Air Force is up to, but It seems like it's just a process of sending out a letter. Is it more complicated than that? Is there a reason that, for instance, you've only sent out a certain amount of the 2,500 that you need to do? I don't really know what takes the time.
Go ahead. I can speak for the Air Force. So this is a difficult task to identify what's an agricultural operation. We went to the Department of Agriculture. We got a very substantial list of potential agricultural operations. We want to make sure that we balance both alarming folks and informing folks. And so we needed to take time to make sure that the folks that were identified by the Department of Agriculture were still valid. And so, in fact, I will give you as an anecdote, we found that in some cases, those records weren't as up to date, and consequently, those operations were no longer in business. And so we needed to go through, do those, and then get these letters out to the installation commanders so that they could send them out to each of the agricultural operations.
Thank you for that. My time is up, but I appreciate your answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pingree. The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Gonzalez, welcome. You are recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today I'm doing this hearing from Brooks Army Medical Center in San Antonio. I previously had done a hearing from Laughlin Air Force Base, and my question to you, Mr. Kramer, is on Laughlin. So Laughlin Air Force Base is the largest Air Force training base in the country. In 2018, it was found that the base had elevated PFAS levels in the groundwater. What steps has DoD taken to notify the active duty members and their families stationed there?
Sir, since I have Mr. Mark Carell here from the Air Force, I'll defer to him to answer that question.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. So I will tell you that from a Department of the Air Force standpoint, the safety and health of our airmen guardians, families, and communities is first and foremost. So as we have approached this in the Air Force, we have a kind of a three-pronged approach, and first and foremost, it's protect human health. How do we do that? We do that by going out and identifying where do we have potential sources that might ultimately get into the drinking water of our airmen, their families, and the surrounding communities. At Laughlin, we've completed the initial preliminary assessment and most of the site inspection. And the good news there is, although there is elevated PFAS, PFO and PFAS in the groundwater, there isn't in the drinking water. And so the challenge we face across the DoD, but particularly in the Air Force, is I have 189 installations where the groundwater is above the 70 parts per trillion for PFO and PFAS. It's going to take us some time to get through each of those, and as Mr. Kramer mentioned before, we do this on a risk basis. And so the good news at Laughlin is there's no connection between that groundwater and people who are drinking that water, which is our first and foremost concern. And so we've built them into the remedial investigation process. We'll continue through CERCLA and ultimately get to addressing the groundwater. In the meantime, continuing the tests that we've discussed to make sure that folks aren't drinking water above the lifetime health advisory.
Thank you for that. And I understand, it's a large organization and there's quite a few installations that you're going to have to go through. Is there a timetable or an estimate timetable of when Laughlin will be addressed?
So what I can't give you a date for Laughlin in terms. So the CERCLA process, as we've discussed before, is multi-years along the way, and the remedial investigation process, because we're going to need to do so many of these, will take several years. So we don't have a list that says here's where each base falls just yet. What I can tell you is that we're going to do about 10 per year between now and FY27 to get through the remedial investigation phase of this or get those contracts awarded. What I will do is go back to the Air Force Civil Engineer Center and see if they do have, when we think we can give you an answer to that.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that.
But Congressman, if I might just interject, please. Yeah. So the key point there is that as Mr. Carell said, is the drinking water. It does not have an exceedance of PFAS in it, and that's the important one. And we can put it just like any BRAC closed installation. There's land use controls you can put on, and so our real focus now is human health, and that's to get the drinking water down below if there's an MCL or the lifetime health advisory. Over.
Great. Thank you for that. Along the same lines, Mr. Kramer, in your testimony, you stated we need a nationwide solution for the PFAS disposal and treatment. How can this committee in particularly help through the military construction appropriations process?
So I think the next action is on EPA. They put out for public comment their disposal guidance. Got a lot of comments back, as I understand, and they're now reviewing those comments, and then they'll put the document back out based on the disposal methods that will be acceptable. Then we would have to come back to the committee because they range anywhere from no incineration to some incineration, and so we got to, once we understand what the approved disposal methods are, we really can't put a ballpark number on or advise the subcommittee on our next steps. So.
Okay, thank you for that. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. The gentleman yields back. We are now going to begin a second round of questions for the first panel. We'll reduce the question time to 3 minutes, and I know a number of members do have a question for the second round. My own first question for the second round is that Mr. Kramer, the last major progress report from the PFAS task force was in March of 2020, and it's been nearly a year since we've received a substantive update. Can you tell us what the task force has been doing during that time, and when can we expect another official progress report?
So the activities of the task force over the last year have mainly been codifying standard policies and practices that we wanted to put out across the entire Department of Defense, because one of the things that early on that Dr. Esper realized when he established the task force, we were inconsistent application across the entire DoD. So most of the PFAS task force in the last year was really focused on that, funding the initial PASIs, those sites, the getting started on all of those activities as we go down to the circular process. But we do owe an update. I realized that too as preparation for this hearing, that it was over a year, and I in fact talked to the staff earlier today about providing that update, and we'll get that to you shortly.
What's the definition of shortly? A month? 6 weeks?
Yes, let's commit to 30 days.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Hastings, what specifically do you need from other agencies, whether that's EPA, CDC, or DoD, to help you make the connection between these health conditions and PFAS exposure? And also, PFAS is one of many types of toxic exposures that veterans suffer during their military service that can lead to serious health conditions. But VA seems to make it very difficult for veterans to prove those health conditions are linked to military service. So if you can also answer, how does your post-deployment health team work to improve how toxic exposures like PFAS are evaluated by the VA?
As far as what we need, ma'am, I would like to take that for the record and give you a very thoughtful, considered approach to that. We have a very good relationship with DoD. In fact, when I first left military service, I served 33 years in the Army. I came to VA to continue serving, and the first thing that we did when I came here in 2017 was I was on the Deployment Health Working Group, and we were talking about PFAS at that time when it had just been designated as a hazardous substance. We talk about that routinely at the Deployment Health Working Group. We look at the things that we need. We, as I said, have the toxicologist who works with our federal partners and academia. We monitor health-related issues, morbidity and mortality, and healthcare utilization. So I would like to give you a thoughtful, considered approach to that, and would like to take that for the record. As far as what we do for veterans to make them understand this, we have training that we have done for our providers, and this would be our PAs, docs, nurses that are taking care of these veterans. We want them to understand what questions they need to ask of their veteran, how to discuss risk and other topics of this sort, health with regards to their health. We also work with social media to get messages out to the veterans. We have put articles about perfluorinated substances in our newsletters. We do have a very robust website that has many of the environmental exposures of concern for veterans. It covers everything from literally A to Z. And we do have one about PFAS on our website. It is one of the things that we keep rotating back to social media, the newsletters. We want veterans to know about this so that they are aware, and education, again, of our providers. With regards to, we work closely with VBA to look at what are the trends in regards to claims. And we've looked at the perfluorinated compounds. We've had less than 20 claims so far that have come in. So we do monitor that because sometimes that lets us know what things we need to look at next. So in regards to your question, I guess the answer would be right now we are giving information to the veterans, information to the providers. We are looking for trends, and in regards to what do we need and how can you help us, I will get you a written answer for that to make sure that it's a thoughtful, considered response.
Thank you. I look forward to continuing our conversation. I appreciate that. Okay, my time has expired. Mr. Valadeo, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Kind of follow down the same path as the chairwoman just went. What symptoms would a veteran have if he or she had significant PFAS exposure?
Sir, the symptoms would not necessarily be just one symptom, so it could be a number of things. These can be endocrine disruptors. We have seen reports that they are related to hypothyroid. We have seen reports that they may be related to pregnancy issues. We know that they can cause some disruption in the liver function tests. There is some literature that says there may be an association with kidney cancer and testicular cancer. So there's not a one size fits all. That's why education of our providers is exceedingly important, so that when they are doing environmental assessments for the veterans, that they ask the appropriate questions. We do the same thing with Agent Orange. We do the same thing with airborne hazards. We do the same thing with K2. There are certain things that may be associated, and so if they are seeing a veteran for Agent Orange, we will ask those questions that may be related to the issues with Agent Orange. For example, we may get lab tests for diabetes. With regards to airborne hazards, we may think earlier about getting pulmonary function tests. If it is a question about with regards to PFAS, we would look at their general health and probably get a panel of labs to see if there is anything that's unusual about their endocrine system, their liver functions. If they're pregnant, we would pay attention to those things that might be cues that they're having problems with preeclampsia or a child that may have a low birth weight.
All right. So does the VA provide additional health monitoring to the service members and families who drink and use water in the area in and around bases that are suspected or known to be contaminated with PFAS?
We are not doing any special monitoring. We are working with ATSDR, and they are doing the studies right now to look at those communities surrounding bases that have been contaminated.
How is the DoD treating state PFAS drinking water standards, and what happens when those conflict with or differ from federal PFAS advisories and recommendations?
Sir, would that question be for me, or would that be for DoD?
That one's directed towards Mr. Kramer.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So in the with respect to properly promulgated state drinking water standards and MCL maximum contaminant level, and we're the purveyor of the water. We produce the water by permit, then we'll meet that MCL limit, if that was your question. So with the conflict between federal lifetime advisory and state standards, those places where we're the permit holder, we'll meet the state MCL. Absent that, we'll meet the 70 parts per trillion.
All right, perfect.
Water, yes.
Well, you'll back the rest of my time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Valadeo. The gentleman yields, Mr. Valadeo, a gentleman yields back. And Ms. Pingree, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay.
Excuse me.
3 minutes.
For 3.
Got it. I'm on it. Thank you. Back to the DOD. The NDAA, the FY21 NDOA, requires the DOD to stop procuring cookware, cooking utensils, upholstered furniture, and carpets made with PFAS and PFAS. Have you stopped procuring those items? Do you plan to extend it to any other items that contain PFAS? Where are you with that?
So I'll take that for the record. It'll come out of our acquisition folks. They'll issue those guidance to the acquisition types, those that DLA type that procure goods and services for us. And over.
Got it. So back to one of the things Mr. Valadeo said. I don't completely understand on this question around the state drinking water standard. What does that mean when you say if we are the permit holder?
If a department, one of the military departments in the Department of Defense is the purveyor, producer of that clean drinking water, that we have to meet the clean drinking water standards or the state standards. If we're not the purveyor, the producer of that clean drinking water, then we rely on others to meet those standards. And generally speaking, if we rely on the local community to produce the water, then they have to meet their own drinking water standards for us. We don't enforce those standards back on the local community.
Okay, I understand that, but let's say you're the source of the contamination and the local communities or nearby wells are contaminated at a level related to the state requirement. Do you clean up to meet the state requirement, or do you just say, well, that's your water supply, even if you're the contaminator?
So are you referring to like private wells surrounding an installation? Is that?
That's a good example.
I just want to make sure we understand the question before we.
Sure.
You want to...
So I'll try to help with that. So under the Safe Drinking Water Act, if the Department of Defense, or in my case, the Department of the Air Force, is producing water like a local water utility would, we must follow a properly promulgated state standard in that drinking water production. If we're talking about things other than where we're producing the drinking water, then we follow the CERCLA process. And the CERCLA process right now allows us to take action at 70 parts per trillion.
Got it. So that process and that change in that number has to do with the actions by the EPA that have yet to occur. So that's why you can follow that other number. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
Okay, my time is over. Thank you. Appreciate your answers.
Thank you, Ms. Pingree. The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Rutherford, you're recognized for 3 minutes. Do you have additional questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, if I could, Mr. Kramer, I know in July 2019, Secretary Esper, when they created this task force, talked about really 4 things: researching the alternative to firefighting foams. We've talked a lot about the remediation and cleanup. What I'm curious about is the number 1 element that was talked about here was finding alternatives. And I know that's ongoing. Are there any successes out there? Very quickly, can you tell me? I think it's important that we stop the damage that we were doing. In fact, in the fiscal year 20 NDAA, Congress directed that we stop using PFAS and the AFFF contaminants, except for ships that are out at sea. So can you tell me 2 things? Number 1, how are we doing on the phase out, and have we found something to replace it?
So we've the actions we've taken. So the complete stop use 2024. We're working towards that timeline, and so the immediate actions is we have directed that the C8 chain PFOA is a larger, higher concentration of PFAS. So we've replaced that with a lower C6 chain. So we're trying to reduce the level of PFAS within the firefighting foams. So that was step one. Step two that we're going after is through the CERTIP ESDC process. We've got 6 candidates that are proving to be worthy of follow-on tests. And the worthiness is we want to rapidly put out fuels fire, that being jet fuel, gasoline fire. So we look into 2 of those. So the first benchmark is 28 square foot. Can you put it out within 30 seconds? So we've got 6 candidates that have passed that. Then we move down the spectrum to a little larger test, the 400 square foot. And ultimately this summer, we're going to do a 1,200 square foot uncontrolled, and FX is 1,200 square foot test out in China Lake in May. And those, the 6 candidates that have made its way. So we're cautiously optimistic that we can find a replacement, a fluorine-free replacement that also puts out not just Jet A fuels fire, which seems to be the easy one because it's kerosene-based. The harder one is the gasoline-based fires. So that's the really controlling entity now. So we're cautiously optimistic we get there.
So very quickly, so my time's about to run out. I appreciate that. So by 2024, is the mission to be completely out of PFAS usage, or simply down to the C6 level?
Completely out. Fluorine. The requirement is fluorine-free firefighting foam. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. My time has run out, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. A gentleman yields back. Mr. Gonzalez. You're recognized for 3 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to follow up to Mr. Rutherford's kind of question on there. So do you feel confident that one of these 6 alternatives will be ready by 2024?
So I'm not the scientist, so I've used the words of the scientists. Are cautiously optimistic. So I think in the scientific community, that means that it's a greater than 50-50 chance that one of those 6 will meet our safety standards. That'll go in. We'll redefine the mil spec and then put those that new mil spec standard into production. So cautiously optimistic is what I was advised to say, but I think it's looking good. Over.
And do we have a alternative plan, or is there a deadline or a schedule that y'all are looking at in order to meet those deadlines, in order to make it before 2024?
So it's a two-parter. One is that we've talked about putting out the fire is the most important, and I think we'll get there for that. The second piece and thank you for giving more time to Mr. Rutherford. I would know I was droning on, but we also have to have a replacement product that does not that is less harmful to the environment than the current AFFF. What we'd hate to do is say, well, it's fluorine free, but it's just as harmful to the environment. We haven't solved our environmental problem. So that is the long pole in the tent, what we call is toxicity. And so we're going through those tests now to ensure that the product we replace is better than the first product that we were using.
Great, thank you for that. I just have one final question. Does DoD consider PFAS the highest remediation priority at BRAC sites?
Well, until we've completely analyzed, all of the BRAC sites to determine, we have some BRAC sites that have some really harmful known carcinogens that I don't know that PFAS will surpass that, and those are the ones that we're taking care of now through the CERCLA process at all our closed BRAC sites.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. The gentleman yields back. I want to thank all of you for appearing before the committee today. We appreciate you providing us with an update on PFAS remediation and cleanup, as well as the steps being taken to address veteran health impact by exposure. Dr. Hastings, I look forward to continuing our discussions and diving more deeply into the work that we could be and should be doing And to the Department of Defense officials, I just want to make it clear that while this committee's funding is only currently responsible for providing cleanup costs for closed military installations, we also are responsible for the health and well-being of our nation's veterans. And so if they become sick as a result of their service when they are in active duty, it is our responsibility to make sure that we can take care of them when they become veterans. And so as a result, we're going to continue to have hearings like this one to be able to make sure that we can ask you questions, because ultimately you affect our bottom line if you are not making sure that our active duty military don't become sick from exposure to PFAS foams and other toxic substances. So just consider yourselves put on notice to that fact. Thank you very much.
Just want to assure we are rowing together towards that objective here in the department.
I'm really glad to hear that. Thank you. We'll now welcome our second panel. Our witnesses include Dr. Jamie DeWitt, Associate Professor, Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology, Brody School of Medicine at East Carolina University, and Ms. Erin Brockovich, an environmental activist, consumer advocate, and president of Brockovich Research and Consulting. Dr. DeWitt, your full written testimony will be included in the record, and you are recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your testimony.
Thank you. And distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on contamination and impact of PFAS. In my position here at the Brody School of Medicine at East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina, I study the toxicological effects of PFAS and how they affect the immune system. We are all probably thinking a lot more about our own immune systems right now because of the COVID pandemic. We also now know that one undesirable health effect of PFAS exposure is a suppressed immune system. This means an increased risk of a reduced response to vaccines, as well as an increased risk to infections. One member of the military community affiliated with Pease Air Force Base recently wrote that the global pandemic is scary for everyone, and it's even scarier knowing that your family has been exposed to chemicals that may hurt the immune system when it's needed most. This is one person among many who's worried about her health, the health of her family, the health of her community from their PFAS exposures, and who lives in a PFAS polluted community in proximity to a military base where AFFFs were used and where PFAS now contaminate sources of drinking water. Exposure to PFAS through drinking water and other sources is known to be linked to a variety of undesirable health effects in people, in addition to effects on the immune system, as you've heard. These include effects that often present as chronic diseases and include the liver, the cardiovascular system, the endocrine system, the reproductive system, and effects on development. Some populations, as you've heard, have also seen increases in kinds of cancer. A recent report indicated that over 700 military sites may be contaminated with PFAS from AFFF uses. These DoD facilities have some of the highest PFAS contamination and detections, and they're likely due to repeated AFFF use in training to those legacy PFAS. As you've heard, it's not easy to clean PFAS out of drinking water. This is partly due to the persistence of PFAS. The vast majority of these nearly 10,000 individual chemicals are so resistant to breakdown that they're sometimes referred to as forever chemicals. As discussed on the first panel, filtration, capture, and transport of PFAS to another location become a problem for someone else. And this isn't really a cost-effective or environmentally sound way to dispose of PFAS. And those who pay are usually taxpayers in one way or another. A major increase in cleanup funding for DoD so that they can quickly clean up some of the most contaminated sites is one part of the solution. Confirming the presence of PFAS across all DoD facilities also would be instrumental in facilitating and prioritizing cleanup efforts for some of these most contaminated sites. I'd like to remind you a little bit of the culture of denial surrounding the toxicity of PFAS. A few years ago, I talked to a civilian firefighter at a U.S. military base. He had this conflicting information about health risks of PFAS, so he called me up. His base safety officer said that PFAS were really no worse for his health than bubble bath. This contradicted information he'd seen about undesirable health effects being found for PFAS. He wondered if he should be worried about himself and his fellow firefighters. At this point, DoD had admitted to concerns about health and environmental effects of PFAS, but how was it possible for the safety officer not to have shared this information with this firefighter? I also have spoken to a former Air Force firefighter who'd also been told by his military leaders that AFFF was just as bad as soap and water, so nothing to worry about. These stories highlight that the DoD should have done and should do a better job of communicating health risks of PFAS to their service members. I also want to mention that turnout gear of fighter fires also contains PFAS, creating yet another PFAS exposure source to firefighters and another potential culture of denial. We've talked about the maximum contaminant levels established in states for individual PFAS. I'd like to emphasize that for PFOS, for example, these are based on potential harms to the immune system, and these are quite a bit lower than the now outdated and minimally protective 70 part per trillion health advisory that the US EPA has developed. I'm heartened to hear that the DoD is committed to cleaning up to these state level MCLs, but it really should be across all sites, regardless of who the purveyor of that water is, because all people in those areas deserve the right to drink water that is free from PFAS and that is clean to the level that is the most health protective and based on the most sound science that we have. I'm glad to hear that fluorine containing AFFFs are being phased out, and that the hope is for substitutes that aren't regrettable. This will prevent future contamination of our water sources, but we do need increased funding for DoD to clean up these hundreds of known and suspected PFAS contamination sites. We need to find a safe way of destroying PFAS. We shouldn't be burning them and spreading them out throughout communities. Veterans and taxpayers shouldn't have to carry the burden of PFAS exposure, and the costs of cleanup shouldn't really fall to taxpayers alone. Some solutions include cleaning up pollution from the use of legacy PFAS, phasing PFAS out of turnout gear, phasing all non-essential uses of PFAS for other industrial and consumer uses, and managing PFAS as a single class of chemicals. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you today, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. DeWitt. Ms. Brockovich, you are your full written testimony will be entered into the record, and you are recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your testimony.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Honorable Chairman Wasserman Schultz and members of the House of Appropriations Subcommittee on Military Construction, Veterans Affairs, and related agencies. Thank you for having me. I am Erin Brockovich. I am a military mom. 2 of my children served in the United States Army, and my son served a tour in Afghanistan. All Americans who serve give the ultimate sacrifice to protect and defend our country. They shouldn't have to sacrifice their health years after their service is complete. It would be much better for you, our representatives, to hear from the tens of thousands of military men and women, firefighters, spouses, children, brothers and sisters, friends and neighbors, and family members who write to me. Today, I am here for them. Across our country, families are exposed to dangerous chemicals in their water, and the families most at risk are those living on or near current and former military bases. PFAS, or per- and polyfluorinated alkyl substances, are a class of synthetic chemicals that are silently ubiquitous and persistent in the environment and are highly toxic. Their ability to repel oil and water and persist at high temperatures makes them attractive for use in everyday items like nonstick cookware, food packaging, water repellent gear, and in the case of the military, firefighting foam used to extinguish jet fuel fires. So far, the Department of Defense has identified 651 active Brock installations in the United States with known or suspected releases of PFAS. The PFAS levels detected in the groundwater on or near these bases should alarm us all. At many bases, including England Air Force Base, Naval Air Station China Lake, Patrick Air Force Base, Naval Air Station Jacksonville, Altus Air Force Base, there are PFAS detections in the groundwater that top 1 million parts per trillion. As you know, the EPA's advisory level is 70 parts per trillion, and many states have now concluded safe PFAS levels are actually between 10 and 20 parts per trillion. So it is deeply concerning that more than 100 bases have detected PFAS at levels greater than 30,000 parts per trillion. Until recently, service members at these bases drank water with PFAS, at some bases, PFAS levels in the drinking water are still above the levels that states consider safe. People have contacted me for years about polluted military sites. Many of them have tried connecting with their local officials, but no one was willing to help or listen or answer their questions. Who are they supposed to turn to for the answers that they deserve? They share with me how they or their family members are sick with kidney issues, testicular cancers, or dealing with infertility issues. What surprised me is how they found out about these contaminations, and it wasn't from the VA or the DoD, but rather from local news stories or NGO websites. I don't blame or want to blame any one person or agency, but I do want to convey the voices and the stories of those who have been harmed. One retired veteran who served from 1989 to 1992 at the Wurtsmith Air Force Base in Escata, Michigan, told me he felt like he was a test subject. He drank the water on base and remembers crawling through AFFF during drills at Wurtsmith. He started a group in 2016 to raise awareness after Michigan health officials issued a drinking water advisory for PFAS in Escata. He has dozens of health issues, including liver disease, cannot have children. Most of his disability benefits and claims have been denied. Many of the people from his group have died. AFFF, used since the late 60s to put out jet fuel fires at places like Wurtsmith, also soaked into the ground, contaminating groundwater and surface water at these installations and in the surrounding communities. Talk to the residents of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, home to former Pease Air Force Base. The abandoned military outpost is now home to apartment buildings, trendy restaurants, offices, and daycare centers. In 2014, a mom learned from a newspaper article that the drinking water in her community was highly contaminated with this substance. Like so many other community members that I have worked with, officials did not respond to her calls or emails, asking questions about how the water could affect the health of her family. So she started her own campaign to get blood tests provided to everyone exposed to the water. While I recognize today is about closed facilities, Luke and Cannon Air Force bases have been forced to provide bottled water as a result of PFAS contamination, while others like Langley Air Force Base remain silent, barely below federal notification levels. DoD is not providing safe water for some of the folks near the bases who rely on well water for their drinking purposes. How extensive is the PFAS pollution in my community? This is what they want to know. When did DoD confirm the presence of PFAS in the groundwater? When will DoD end non-essential use of PFAS in items like food packaging and cosmetics? What do I do if I have high PFAS in my blood? And most importantly, questions asked, when will DoD clean up the contamination? Why hasn't the DoD alerted service members after 3M came in 2000 and warned DoD officials that PFAS, the main ingredient, was toxic? Why hasn't it taken an active? Yes.
Ms. Brockovich, if you could wrap up your testimony, please.
Okay. I was just getting there. So okay. PFAS, which contaminates the blood and organs in nearly every living being, and experts estimate that 25% of Americans have troubling levels of PFAS. It is important for our service members and the communities that they are prepared and they have information. These service members and our defense communities make enormous sacrifices to keep us safe. We should do our part in keeping them safe. And thank you for allowing me this time.
Thank you both for your compelling testimony. We greatly appreciate it. Dr. DeWitt, I want to start with you. Could you explain to us the historical timeline of PFAS research? When were the first warning signs, and how long were they swept under the rug by major industries or ignored by government agencies?
Thank you for that question, Madam Chairwoman. The The toxicological information of PFAS were studied by some of the companies that made these compounds. And to our knowledge, some of the earliest reports of toxicity emerged in the 50s and 60s. These were studies done with primates demonstrating actually effects on the immune system. But these didn't really emerge in the literature that I had access to as a scientist until about the 1980s. And even then, there were just trickles of information. It really wasn't until the 1990s or 2000s that we started seeing copious amounts of information about the toxicity of PFAS. So the information was kept under the rug for decades.
I think you're muted, Debbie.
You know, the computers just mute you randomly. Sorry about that. Can you give us examples, Dr. DeWitt, of effective ways of permanently cleaning up contamination in the environment? Do you know of any agencies that are actively doing so? And are there any universities that are looking into innovative ways to clean up PFAS contamination?
Yes, there are several attempts by different university researchers as well as some nonprofit organizations that are looking for ways to actually degrade PFAS, because as you've heard right now, the only way to eliminate PFAS from, for example, drinking water is to filter them. So we don't have a way of degrading them. There has been at least one scientific report of a group that has discovered some microorganisms that can break down PFOA and PFOS, but this is in a little bottle, not on a large scale. We've also seen some reports of chemical breakdown of PFAS, again, on a little bottle in a laboratory bench. But I think we have some promise that in maybe a few years to decades, we could have some efforts that will degrade PFAS, but that doesn't address the question about what we do with PFAS in contaminated water right now.
Yeah. It's been argued, Dr. DeWitt, that because PFAS is so common, and you heard that testimony here today, that tracking exposure among veterans would not be effective. Do you agree with that? Is there useful data that could be obtained from testing for tracking or otherwise evaluating PFAS in veteran populations?
Well, you can't find what you're not looking for. And if you're not measuring PFAS levels in people's blood, if you're not measuring PFAS levels in tissue samples that you might obtain from biopsies, unfortunately, looking at tissue concentrations in people after they've died would be another way of understanding relationships. So you're not going to find what you're not looking for, as I said. So it's really important that we start to monitor veterans and other individuals, at least for the health effects that we know have strong linkages to PFAS exposure.
And perhaps active duty military, rather than saying that we have other priorities. Thank you. Ms. Brockovich, we thank you for your entire family's service, particularly as a mother of 2 service members, and it's clear that this is personal to you. Can you outline your experience with PFAS contamination on and around closed military installations, including the impact it's had on veteran health, the environment, and surrounding communities?
Yes, and my concern is always for them and how overwhelmed I am with emails and correspondence from those service members and their families with frustrations on feeling like they're not getting information or lack of communication, with misunderstandings with the VA about their health and how it's treated. They are very astute in the PFAS. They're aware that it's in the base or past their base in their closed bases, but their frustration on not being able to get answers or the help that they feel that they need. That is my biggest experience with PFAS in military. It is a national issue and one of great importance, but I know what we're talking about here today, and it's our military. That they're reaching out to me in very large numbers because they feel they can't get their representatives to respond to them or communication on how they should be handling their health crisis.
Yeah, this committee covers the entire life cycle of someone who's served on active duty all the way through the time that they're a veteran, and we cover the whole budget for the VAs, which is part of why we're having this hearing. And I'm sure you've heard during your experience advocating on this issue the claim that there's not enough research on the effects of PFAS exposure. Is that accurate from your personal experience in working in this field?
Absolutely, that the science isn't there yet, but they hear conflicting stories that it is, and they talk amongst each other. They have groups, they're learning, they're knowledgeable, yet they have some of those symptoms that we've shared here today of kidney or liver or testicular cancer or infertility, yet it still won't be said to them that this is consistent with an exposure. We're not sure that this is applicable, therefore they're not getting help. So there's great frustration with them.
Thank you. My time's expired, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Valadeo, is recognized for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate your first questions there. It was really what I wanted to ask as well, was the ongoing research, but I did want to follow up with just a simple, how can we support this research? Dr. DeWitt.
Thank you. Well, I'm a scientific researcher at an academic institution, so funding for toxicological research and epidemiological research is always going to accelerate information that we're able to develop, but also funding nonprofit organizations and research at the DoD to see what we can do about finding ways of degrading PFAS and not just filtering them. Thank you for that question.
I appreciate that. And then personal protection. If an individual or family finds out that a drinking water contains PFAS above EPA standards, what should they do to protect themselves besides switching to bottled water? Is there treatment systems that work well, like RO systems or others? Have you seen anything specific out there that we should be telling our constituents to look towards?
So there's a really great group of researchers from North Carolina State University and Duke University who recently published a study of point-of-use filters that people can put into their homes. And they found that reverse osmosis filters really did a great job of filtering out most PFAS, including the legacy PFAS and the ones that are the replacements, the shorter chains. Unfortunately, for many people, especially those associated with military communities, these are cost prohibitive. So we would need some sort of grants or other assistance for people to get these point of use filters into their homes. There also are whole home filters available, but those are likely cost prohibitive, except for a very few individuals.
All right, and to follow up with that, when it comes to citywide, when you get into some of our communities, and my communities tend to range from 10 to 15,000 as high as 60,000 folks in a city. Have you seen any projects or any products that would work well, or any cities that I can look to for direction on how best to handle PFAS in their water systems?
So here in North Carolina, we have a water system that's been contaminated with PFAS, mostly from an industrial facility. One community decided to install a granular activated carbon filter, which is just filtering out the PFAS. And this, I think, will be contributing water to about 250,000 people. Just across the river, another facility has decided to institute a reverse osmosis system. And again, that's just filtering out the water. One is more expensive than the other, and ultimately these costs will get handed down to the ratepayers. So the polluter isn't paying, but those who need clean water are the ones paying for these systems.
All right. Well, that's all I've got. So I appreciate your time today, and I yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Valadeo. Ms. Pingree, you're recognized for your 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for your testimony and for the work you've been doing on this really challenging topic. Dr. DeWitt, we heard from the military, and we know this, that this process of evaluating where the PFAS contamination is at either BRAC bases or existing bases is excruciatingly slow. We were told they wouldn't even have a sense of all the bases or BRAC bases that could be contaminated till 2023. Then they have to start the cleanup. Can you just speculate on the health consequences of something like this that we know is a health challenge taking that long?
I don't understand really why it would take that long. Here in North Carolina, we have a network that was established by our state government to evaluate all of the water sources here in North Carolina, at least in public systems and some wells. And it's taken only a couple of years to do that surveillance. And this was for a much longer list of PFAS than what are on some of the current methods. every day that somebody drinks PFAS, they're going to take more into their body. And as you've heard, it takes a tremendously long period of time for those PFAS to get eliminated from our body. Some can take up to 8 years. I've heard reports of some of the newer PFAS being in our bodies for 20 years before half is eliminated. And so every little bit of exposure is going to build up that concentration inside of our bodies. So we really can't delay.
So that's a good point, that if North Carolina has assessed their entire state and other kinds of facilities, not just military facilities, this really shouldn't have to take so long, particularly since committees like this have been offering the resources to make it possible. Is that true?
Yes, I would think so. And this was done mostly by academic researchers, so teams of students and professors doing lots of amazing work to collect water and evaluate various PFAS in these water sources.
Thanks. Ms. Brockovich, thank you so much for the work that you've done and are continuing to do. You mentioned that you hear a lot of concerns from members of the military or veterans who contact you, I think looking for more information or support. If we were to turn it around and say to the VA or Department of Defense, you know, here's what you should be providing, here's the level of transparency, or here's the information people really want, what would you say that they should be putting out there?
One, having an effective communication strategy between whether it be DOD or the VA and the military servicemen and women and their families. Their first concern is, are they still being exposed today? If they are, how they're getting safe water. As we've discussed, what type of filtrations, that gives them some assurance. But most importantly, I know that information goes out via email and stuff, but it's like they really need a person to connect to and that they can talk with, and so that they feel that they're being heard. And that just adds to the compound and their angst of, we're not getting questions and answers. They're concerned about themselves, their spouses, their children. Are they getting safe water at that moment? How do they get it? And just not being put off. That goes a really, really long way. There seems to be a big disconnect between the DOD and the VA and their communications directly with these service members and their families. And it would go a long way for their well-being, because they're already facing the fact that they've been exposed and they're frightened to hear from you or meetings or get them together as a group. What is happening? So there's a breakdown in communication, and I think it is critical that that happen.
Thank you. It seems like the least that could be done is to provide people with the information about health impacts they may be experiencing at the moment in time, particularly for those who are serving our country or have served our country. One more question, I'm running out of time, but quickly, Dr. DeWitt, I think the chair really tried to allude to this, and the thing that we heard from the VA from the sort of health side was that if there was a way to test someone when they, say, for instance, came into the military, and then, you know, after they were out of the military or at some point, to see what that exposure was because of this idea that you could have high levels already. Is that even a practical idea to determine, you know, how much people could be impacted during their time in service?
Oh, I think so. These are long-lived chemicals, and we have some really smart chemists who are developing some fingerprinting approaches. So you could look at somebody's PFAS before they enter the military in their blood and say, oh, it looks like these are the ones found mostly in food or in textiles. And then after their service, you could go, oh, yes, this profile is clearly indicative of a FFF exposure. So we're developing ways that may make that very feasible.
Thank you. Thanks again for your work. Appreciate it. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Pingree. The gentlelady yields back. That last one was a great follow-up. I appreciate that. Okay, Mr. Rutherford, you're recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Dr. DeWitt, I want to kind of continue down this road Congresswoman Pingree was going. And that is, when I see your statement and realize that PFAS is in 10,000 compounds, and it's in things like nonstick pans and you know, I think I heard that one when nonstick pans first came out, actually, that there were cancer-causing elements in that. And that's back when you could scrape it and it would come off. I think they've done a better job of that now. But then even you mentioned, I think, permanent press clothing and those sorts of things where this chemical, some of these compounds are being used. Where does, when we look at the EPA standards, I'm shocked when I see 70 parts per trillion level. That's the current EPA standard, is that right? Or is that just for this AFFF compound?
So the current EPA Lifetime Health Advisory, which remember isn't a standard, it has no regulatory teeth, is 70 parts per trillion in drinking water, and it's just for 2 individual PFAS, perfluorooctanoic acid or PFOA, and perfluorooctane sulfonic acid or PFOS. Okay,
and the recommendation that it should be 10 to 20 parts per trillion, is that more in line with where you think it should be, and where did that number come from?
So my line of thinking is that these are synthetic industrial compounds that really the acceptable level should be 0. We shouldn't have any of these compounds in our water, in our air, in our food, in our bodies. But some states have taken an approach by using data from the immune system, for example, because it's a sensitive system that's affected by PFAS, and have come up with maximum contaminant levels for drinking water of anywhere from about 8 to 13 or so parts per trillion.
Right. So if now you mentioned that they can tell the difference between AFFF PFAS contamination and whether it's coming from some other industrial source. I guess my question is, if I take my tap water at my house and have it tested, can they give me PFAS information on what's in my water? And how expensive is that? And can people do that? Are there labs out there that do those tests for citizens?
So there are some commercial testing labs available, but they only test for a suite of PFAS. And these are labs that are certified by the United States EPA. And there's a couple of different methods, method 537 and method 537.1. I think those cover 24 individual PFAS. So out of the 10,000, we only test for about 24. And these tests, I think, cost about $300 to $500 for a sample of water. And you would get information back on what level these 24 different PFAS would be in your water.
Okay. All right. And so you mentioned that you can also do blood testing, and you can find PFAS in your blood.
The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, through their National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, has been testing for PFAS in people's blood and people's urine for a number of years. And 98 to 99% of the people who they test through that have detectable concentrations of at least one individual PFAS in their blood. You probably have PFAS in your blood. I know I do because I work with them. And most people around you likely have one or more individual PFAS in their blood.
Well, I'm sure I do too, because there's 10,000 compounds out there with PFAS in it. So is this a naturally occurring thing, or is it man-made?
Oh no, these are synthetic. So they were made by people. They were developed in the 1930s or 40s. I can't remember which decade, and they were sort of developed by accident.
So we built these 10,000 compounds?
So some of them were constructed specifically for use in chemical processes, but some of them are byproducts. Some of them aren't intentionally produced. They're produced accidentally when you release one compound in the water and it degrades. So there is some degradation of PFAS. These are considered precursors, but they degrade to other PFAS that are then stable and persistent.
Thank you very much. I just learned more about this than I ever knew. So thank you very much. I see my time's run out, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. Yeah, you can see why they're called forever chemicals, based on Dr. DeWitt's testimony. Okay, Mr. Bishop, welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
I will not have 5 minutes, but let me thank Dr. DeWitt and Ms. Brockovich for their testimony. I apologize for not having been earlier. I was presiding over another hearing. Let me just ask you, and at the risk of being redundant, to just state what really meaningful changes that you believe that the Department of Defense has made to address PFAS contamination, the most meaningful and most significant. And do you feel that they are addressing the problem effectively, or do you think there needs to be more involvement from DOD and from the Environmental Protection Agency?
Would you like me to address that, or Ms. Brockovich? Well, I think you're on mute.
You, if you like.
So I'm a laboratory scientist, and I have several colleagues who have received funds from the DoD through some of their environmental programs. So I think that the DoD has been making some efforts in terms of understanding how PFAS can affect organisms in the environment. But I haven't seen that type of funding from the DoD, at least from the scientific realm, to ask questions about effects of PFAS on the health of military personnel, both active duty and veterans. So I would like to see more efforts put into that type of research, and they certainly need more funding from this committee, for example, to facilitate cleanup efforts at some of the most contaminated sites.
Thank you.
I will respond there and interject. Hearing from the servicemen and women, there has been some action taken. It's been slow, it's been delayed, and it's a situation that's getting way ahead of the DoD and the VA. So I would share with you that service members would feel that quicker responses are going to be needed. That it has been slow and delayed, and concerns that it's getting ahead of them.
Thank you both for your candid comments there. And with that, I will yield back my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. I'm not sure if the other members have any additional questions. I have one, so I'm going to ask that, and then happy to recognize any of the other members who are remaining on the meeting. Ms. Brockovich, I want to ask you about the role that PFAS suppliers like 3M have played in the story. The Oversight Committee, on which I also sit, has done a lot of investigatory work in this space, and what we found is disturbing. The testimony from 3M, DuPont, other companies really was about as opaque as it could be, and they made every effort not to answer questions, to deny, to deceive. So I'm curious to learn about what you've encountered with this history of cover-up and deception, and what do those who have been affected by PFAS think about this as far as what should be done?
Well, I share with you, and I've seen the same cover-up, the fact that this has been known since the early 60s, that it was a cancer-causing compound in studies, and how it was concealed and kept from everybody, and where our delays in jumping in and stopping it before the horse got out of the barn, because that's exactly what's happened. It's going to be really hard for us to bring it back. It's extremely frustrating for the people. I mean, they were helpless. They were vulnerable. They had no idea what was coming. And just the sheer idea that something of this magnitude was covered up, and they have to suffer that fate with poor health and or diseases is, I almost don't have any words for it. And I don't know that they do. I think it is utter frustration, disappointment, sickening, fear, and delays and not getting responses just makes it that much worse. I have seen exactly what you have, and it's deplorable, and they are going to have to suffer the outcome. And It's deep saddening for them.
Thank you. Yeah, it is very troubling that we have had, I mean, we keep making reference to the 60s that this has been known to be a toxic substance. That's my entire life, literally. I would imagine that it's yours as well. So
Yes.
I mean, to have gone through this amount of deception and stonewalling and opacity, and now to have the foot dragging that is going on in terms of making sure that we can get our own government agencies to take this seriously, to engage in aggressive cleanup is very, it's more than frustrating. It's dangerous, and every year that we take to not aggressively get this stuff cleaned up and cease its use is another year that we are exposing. No matter what, where else, I don't really care where else they get that people get exposed. I know I'm, as chair of this subcommittee, responsible for making sure that we can provide the funding to at least address the exposure that results from their military service and from making sure that the VA can take care of the healthcare problems that result from that exposure. That's our job on this subcommittee. And I certainly would be actually a great idea to track the level of exposure in the bloodstream of a person who enters military service, and then, as they proceed through their life cycle as a member of the military on into their status as a veteran. And then at the end of their military service, see where they are. Because then by process of elimination and subtraction, you could really determine how much more exposure they'd had as a result of their service, or at least to some degree. So that's my goal, and so that's why this hearing has been more wide ranging than just being limited to how quickly are we getting the BRAC bases cleaned up, because it's a lot deeper than that, particularly because we're responsible for the health of our veterans. So I understand Mr. Valadeo does not have any additional questions. Mr. Bishop, do you?
Don't, Madam Chair.
Okay, all right. Well, that concludes this afternoon's hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for participating today. We look forward to continuing to work with you, and thank you for making time, both of you, to contribute to this body of work that we are reviewing. And with that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Thank you.